Arthur Bennet shouted angrily, slamming the table as he stood up. Eleanor Bennet sneered, realizing that William Clark had held a grudge against her words at the Golden Flower Temple. He wanted to ensure she could never marry. She thought him truly malicious, and she didn't need someone so petty. If love couldn't even offer blessings, it was certainly selfish. Perhaps it was time she confronted him, to show that Eleanor Bennet no longer cared about such meaningless reputations. Just as Eleanor Bennet was about to step forward, she noticed the butler leading eunuch Liam hastily into the hall. Arthur Bennet, upon seeing eunuch Liam, immediately went to greet him. Eleanor Bennet was puzzled by his presence. William Clark also recognized eunuch Liam, who served the emperor, and quickly moved to greet him. Eunuch Liam, greetings. Arthur Bennet promptly paid his respects. Greetings, Lord Bennet, eunuch Liam replied. The top scholar is here too. Eunuch Liam remarked with some surprise upon seeing William Clark. Eunuch Liam, greetings. William Clark bowed respectfully. Master Bennet, His Majesty's headache has relapsed. Our family has been specifically ordered to invite Dr. Bennet to the palace. Oh, butler, quickly summon the young lady. Arthur Bennet, hearing it was a royal decree, dared not delay. Father, there's no need to trouble the butler. Eleanor Bennet stepped out from the adjacent room. Eleanor Bennet. William Clark was startled, not expecting her to always hide in the shadows. Could it be that she had overheard everything he just said? Eleanor Bennet merely cast him a glance, her eyes carrying a hint of disdain. Eunuch Liam, Eleanor Bennet greets you. Eleanor Bennet smiled courteously, her mood unaffected by the recent annulment of her engagement. Chapter 40, Not yet married but already abandoned? 3/3, Master Bennet, His Majesty's headache has returned. Without you, it won't do. Eunuch Liam, Eleanor Bennet will accompany you to the palace immediately. Eleanor Bennet departed the Bennet residence with eunuch Liam, followed by everyone else. Father, Mother, I'll head to the palace first. Eleanor Bennet bowed to bid farewell to Arthur Bennet and Lady Bennet. Mother, please take care of your health. Eleanor Bennet looked at Lady Bennet and could see the reluctance in her eyes. Eleanor. Lady Bennet, feeling heartache and unwilling to part, began to shed tears. Mother, I'll visit the residence often in the future. Eleanor Bennet sweetly smiled and glanced at William Clark. Master William Clark, the Bennet family has received your annulment letter. From now on, the Bennet and Clark families have no further ties. I wish you success in your career and prosperity in all things. Eleanor Bennet showed no sign of distress or sorrow, instead cheerfully accepting the situation. Standing nearby, eunuch Liam had discerned the situation. So, the top scholar and Miss Bennet were once betrothed. However, Eleanor Bennet's composed and carefree demeanor was unlike someone who had just been abandoned. Truly a remarkable young woman. Eleanor Bennet boarded the carriage, and eunuch Liam promptly ordered the palace servants to head back. Arthur Bennet looked at William Clark with a triumphant expression. Eunuch Liam's timely arrival today was perfect. The Bennet family has received the letter of annulment, and I have other matters to attend to, so I won't see you off. Arthur Bennet dismissed the guest, arrogantly stepping into the residence. A young man, still inexperienced, dared to show off in front of him, truly naive. Not to mention the deep roots of the Bennet family in the court, Eleanor Bennet's current status in the palace alone was something a mere scholar could not compare to. But between Eleanor Bennet, King Edward, and the king, who did she favor more? Thinking about this, Arthur Bennet couldn't help but feel troubled. He intended to ask Eleanor Bennet, but William Clark disrupted the opportunity. Time was on his side, and he would have to wait until Eleanor Bennet returned home to discuss it. William Clark hadn't expected to be humiliated today, feeling a bit frustrated as he stepped into the carriage. He couldn't forget her, and his heart was hurt once again. She wasn't sad about the annulment at all. Had she truly forgotten him completely? Eleanor Bennet, why were you so heartless? William Clark's eyes flashed with unwillingness and resentment. Young master, shall we head home? The carriage driver asked from outside. To Minister Page's residence. William Clark thought of Arthur Bennet's arrogant demeanor, and his anger flared. If he wanted to defeat the Bennet family in the future, he needed strong backing. This time, the imperial examination was overseen by Minister Page, who was also his mentor. If he could gain his support, he would have a place in the court. William Clark quickly arrived at Minister Page's residence, where the servant recognized him and invited him inside. Jonathan Page and Arthur Bennet were both second-rank civil officials, and besides left Prime Minister Ethan Farmer, they were the only two. However, Jonathan Page did not get along with Arthur Bennet, and they secretly competed for the position of Right Prime Minister. Jonathan Page was somewhat aware of the situation between William Clark and the Bennet family and intended to win William Clark over. "Nephew, come into the hall and sit." Jonathan Page greeted William Clark warmly. "Mentor, please go ahead." William Clark bowed respectfully. Jonathan Page was pleased and instructed someone to serve tea. "Mentor, I've been busy lately and haven't visited, please don't hold it against me," William Clark said, standing up and clasping his hands. "William, there's no need to be so formal," Jonathan Page replied with a smile. "Master, dinner is ready," the butler announced as he entered the hall. "William, stay for dinner tonight," Jonathan Page warmly invited, and William Clark happily accepted. "Invite the lady and the young miss to the front hall for dinner," Jonathan Page instructed the butler, who quickly understood and left. William Clark seemed to realize something as well. Jonathan Page had a daughter, the child of a concubine, just at the age of marriage, still in her room awaiting a suitor. Could it be that Jonathan Page intended to marry off his daughter? William Clark thought about it and decided that if he could form an alliance with the Tran family, his goals would be achieved. The two men politely yielded to each other and moved to the side hall. Eleanor Bennet hurried to the Hall of Heavenly Purity, where she saw concubine Florence serving tea to Alexander King. Alexander King was reclining on the bed, resting with his eyes closed. "Your Majesty, concubine Florence." Eleanor Bennet approached and bowed. "Eleanor Bennet is here. Rise." Alexander King opened his eyes, a slight smile on his lips. "Beloved concubine, return to your quarters and rest. With Dr. Bennet here, there's no need to worry." Alexander King seemed to intentionally send concubine Florence away, though his words were full of affection. "I obey, Your Majesty." Concubine Florence, her face full of concern, glanced at Eleanor Bennet before leaving the inner chamber. Eleanor Bennet felt uneasy under concubine Florence's gaze. "Your Majesty, allow me to check your pulse first." Eleanor Bennet approached and knelt by the bed, carefully taking his pulse. "Eleanor Bennet, how is Charles's health?" Alexander King suddenly inquired about Charles King, startling Eleanor Bennet. "Your Majesty, Prince King's illness can only be treated superficially by me, as the root cause has not been found." Eleanor Bennet replied respectfully with her head lowered. Your Majesty likely had a restless sleep last night. I will prescribe some calming medicine, and after a few days, you will feel better. Eleanor Bennet stood up and responded. With you by my side, my health has improved significantly. Alexander King appeared quite worried. Your Majesty, perhaps it's best not to worry too much. Eleanor Bennet understood that the Emperor was likely concerned about Charles King's health, but why did Charles King seem unappreciative? What exactly was going on between the father and son? Eleanor Bennet bowed and left, filled with doubt as she exited the Hall of Heavenly Purity. As she walked through the corridor, she overheard some palace maids whispering. Have you heard? There's been another haunting at Serenity Palace. Really? The cries have been heard again for several nights. Some attendants even saw a figure passing through the main hall. Could it be the ghost of the Empress seeking revenge? Keep your voice down if you want to keep your head. The maids quickly dispersed in a panic upon seeing Eleanor Bennet approach, their eyes full of fear. Eleanor Bennet caught the words, Serenity Palace. Wasn't that the Empress's residence? Judging by the maid's terrified expressions, there was undoubtedly some secret yet to be uncovered there. Lost in thought, Eleanor Bennet made her way back to the Imperial Medical Institute. Chapter 41, Serenity Palace. Eleanor Bennet returned to the Imperial Medical Institute, once again examining the old medical records of the Empress, her expression filled with doubt. Calculating the timeline, it seems that the poison affecting Charles King only emerged after the Empress's death, and at that time, Charles King was just a child. Why would someone inflict such a cruel poison on a child? Could the mysterious death of the Empress have been caused by the same person? Serenity Palace, a forbidden area within the palace and even the court, what secrets did it hide all those years ago? Eleanor Bennet pondered, deciding to visit Serenity Palace tonight to uncover the truth. In the dead of night, even the moon hid behind clouds, casting an eerie veil over the already deserted Serenity Palace. Eleanor Bennet, dressed in servant attire, quietly walked along the corridors of Serenity Palace. The courtyard was overgrown with wild grass, desolate and abandoned. This desolation resembled more of a tomb than the Empress's quarters. Occasionally, the cries of cats sent shivers down Eleanor Bennet's spine. The shadows of trees swayed in the wind, resembling ghostly figures. If Alexander King truly cherished the Empress, why was her residence left in such neglect? Eleanor Bennet realized that perhaps everything was a facade. The supposed love and paternal affection might not compare to the pursuit of imperial power. The more she thought, the more she felt enveloped in layers of conspiracy and mystery. Eleanor Bennet entered the main hall and noticed a slightly ajar door. Inside, it was pitch black and cold, causing her to feel a twinge of fear. She did not believe in ghosts, but the atmosphere made her hesitate. After a moment's pause, she gently stepped inside. At that moment, the clouds parted, and moonlight streamed in. The cold moonlight illuminated the room, allowing Eleanor Bennet to see the furnishings covered in thick dust, and the curtains exuded a musty smell. Covering her nose, she proceeded into the inner chamber. There, she found a large antique pearwood bed, its green curtains drawn, obscuring the view inside. Beside the bed stood a silk screen depicting a beautiful woman holding a feather fan. The woman had willow-like eyebrows, a high bun, red lips, and skin as white as jade. Eleanor Bennet paused, staring at the woman in the painting, feeling a sense of familiarity. Her attention was drawn to some lines inscribed on the screen, "Who watches the bright moon during mid-autumn?" The west wind chills as rain falls on the sycamore, the frail body grows heavier, hearing the lamentations outside, the cricket's song by the grass. echoing through the paper window, resenting a long, melancholic dream. Eleanor Bennet silently read these lines, recognizing them as a poem, each word laden with sorrow. The writer's deep melancholy resonated with her, affecting her mood. In this Serenity Palace, there existed such profound sadness. She slowly approached a phoenix-carved dressing table, though covered in dust, the golden phoenixes on the bronze mirror still shone. The table was cluttered with cosmetic boxes, their original colors faded. Eleanor Bennet opened a powder box, releasing a delicate fragrance. The scent was unique, rich yet not overpowering, elegant yet vibrant. It was a fragrance she had never encountered in the palace. Eleanor Bennet slipped the powder box into her sleeve, suspecting it was a personal belonging of the Empress. Often, only unique items provided opportunities for exploitation. Eleanor Bennet was deep in thought when she heard a commotion outside the chamber. Startled, she quickly hid behind the bed. Through the curtain, she saw a dark figure enter. Eleanor clutched her chest, trying to calm herself. The figure stepped into the inner chamber and stood motionless before the screen. Eleanor could tell it was a man, his face completely obscured by a black cloak. She breathed lightly, afraid to alert him. Her mind was filled with questions. Why was this person sneaking into Serenity Palace in the dead of night, and who was the beauty on the screen that held his attention for so long? At that moment, the moonlight was obscured, making Serenity Palace even darker. The silence was so profound it seemed one could hear a pin drop. Eleanor nearly held her breath, fearing to disturb the man in black. He seemed to sense something, gazing intently towards the bed. Eleanor hugged her wildly beating heart, not daring to look out. She knew that if discovered, escape would be nearly impossible. The man in black slowly approached the curtain, and Eleanor knew she had been found. She closed her eyes, awaiting her fate. Suddenly, a flute-like sound echoed from outside, resembling a mournful cry. No wonder some palace servants mistook it for a ghostly wail. The man in black quickly darted outside, and Eleanor couldn't help but sigh in relief. She remained motionless, listening intently to the outside. Soon, the sound ceased. Eleanor cautiously approached the window to assess the situation outside. The man in black was standing outside the chamber, his face still obscured. "So, you have come?" the man in black addressed the deserted courtyard. Eleanor looked out but saw no one. "On her Memorial Day, I must come." As soon as these words were spoken, Eleanor saw another dark figure emerge from the shadows beneath a tree, also clad in black with a silver mask. Memorial Day? Eleanor was puzzled by these strange words, unable to discern the identities of the two individuals. This was the late Empress's chamber. Perhaps the person was the late Empress. Eleanor's mind was in turmoil, her intuition telling her this was a love triangle entwined with dark schemes. "Since you dare to come, today will be your death." The man in black leaped forward, engaging in a fierce battle with the masked figure. Their fight was intense, seemingly evenly matched. Eleanor watched the lethal moves of the man in black, his murderous intent palpable. After dozens of exchanges, the man in black began to falter, struck by a powerful blow from the masked figure, causing him to stagger back several steps. "I won't let you die easily. The pain you caused me over the years, I will repay tenfold." The masked figure laughed loudly before vanishing. At that moment, several men in black rushed in from the courtyard, kneeling before the injured man in black. "Master, should we pursue?" "No need." The man in black glanced at the unpredictable dark clouds on the horizon before hastily leaving Serenity Palace. Eleanor Bennet watched the dangerous scene that had just concluded, unable to comprehend it. To come and go freely in the heavily guarded palace as if it were uninhabited, this person's martial arts must be profound and unfathomable. The two seemed to have a deep-seated grudge, possibly tied to complicated emotions involving the former owner of Serenity Palace. To truly understand the entanglements, one would need to uncover what happened 10 years ago. Eleanor Bennet sneaked out of Serenity Palace, using the cover of night to return to the Imperial Medical Institute. She retrieved the pulse records from years ago but still found no clues. Suddenly recalling the powder she had brought back, she hurriedly used a silver needle to test it, only to be disappointed as the powder was not poison. However, she remained convinced that the Empress had indeed died from poisoning. Currently, Serenity Palace had become a taboo subject in the palace, making it nearly impossible to glean information from the older servants. Eleanor Bennet sat until dawn, and after preparing herself, she quickly ate breakfast and headed to the Hall of Heavenly Purity to check the Emperor's pulse. Passing through the Imperial Gardens, she saw Lady Li, the head of the palace, scolding several palace matrons under the corridor. Eleanor Bennet deliberately walked through this corridor and bowed upon seeing Lady Li. "So it's Lord Bennet. I pay my respects." Lady Li appeared somewhat puzzled, as Eleanor Bennet usually did not interact with her and seemed to have come here deliberately today. "Lady Li, please accept my greetings," Eleanor Bennet said with a smile. "Is Lord Bennet on the way to the Hall of Heavenly Purity to check the Emperor's pulse? I dare not delay you, and I hope to invite you for tea at the Palace Bureau another day." Lady Li seemed reluctant to converse further with Eleanor Bennet. "Why is Lady Li so angry this early in the morning?" Eleanor Bennet looked at the matrons kneeling on the ground but did not hurry to leave. The Empress Dowager will return next month, and the Emperor has ordered a welcoming banquet, but these palace workers have failed to properly prepare, damaging the glazed lamps meant for the Empress Dowager's blessings. Lady Li was curious why Eleanor Bennet was suddenly interested in palace affairs. They are all elderly palace workers, such negligence is understandable. No wonder Lady Li is upset. Such intricate items must require a lot of effort to craft. Eleanor Bennet observed the broken lamps beside them, which were indeed exquisite. Who wouldn't agree? With the banquet approaching, I am worried sick about this issue. Lady Li, please calm down. Since it has happened, punishing them won't help. It's better to think of a replacement solution. Eleanor Bennet reassured, already having an idea in mind. Does Lord Bennet have any good suggestions? If you can resolve this, I would be extremely grateful. Lady Li was indeed troubled by the matter. Remembering Eleanor Bennet's impressive display at the Chrysanthemum exhibition, perhaps she could indeed help. Eleanor Bennet once read in an ancient book about a lamp with a very novel design. The method is simple. If the crafting department can make it, it could certainly solve this urgent problem. Eleanor Bennet recalled the Kongming lantern, adding some decorations wouldn't be difficult. Importantly, such lamps had never appeared in this era. If so, I am extremely grateful. Chief Steward Li bowed in thanks. It's a small matter, I hope Chief Steward will spare these palace managers. Eleanor Bennet looked at the palace workers kneeling on the ground, guessing they were from the crafting department. Manager Sina, today Lord Bennet has pleaded on behalf of your crafting department, so I will not pursue this further. But you must quickly complete the lamp that Lord Bennet mentioned. If you continue to be lazy, the offenses will pile up, and I will show no mercy. Chief Steward Li said to an older palace worker kneeling on the ground. They quickly bowed their heads in gratitude. If that's the case, Manager Sina, please go to the Imperial Medical Institute later to get the lamp design. Eleanor Bennet smiled and bid farewell to Chief Steward Li. The people in the crafting department expressed their gratitude to Eleanor Bennet. Before leaving, Eleanor Bennet looked at the kneeling Manager Sina and gave a friendly smile. Today's actions were actually part of her deliberate plan, with the ultimate goal being Serenity Palace. Survival in the palace is a mutual reliance, as well as a struggle. Today she helped the crafting department out of trouble, merely sowing a seed of goodwill. Eleanor Bennet leisurely walked to the Hall of Heavenly Purity but did not see Eunuch Liam. She stood waiting outside the hall for an announcement. A moment later, a eunuch emerged. Eleanor Bennet looked several times, feeling this person was unfamiliar. Lord Bennet, the Emperor has decreed that you don't need to check the pulse today. Lord Bennet, please return. Eleanor thanks the eunuch. Eleanor Bennet glanced at the eunuch with suspicion, then turned around to see Edward King, David King, and Richard King approaching leisurely. I greet Prince Edward, Prince David, and Prince Richard. Eleanor Bennet bowed in salute. Dr. Bennet, are you here to check the pulse for the Emperor? Edward King helped Eleanor Bennet stand up. A few days ago, she was taken to Duke Duke's residence by the old ninth, and he had been worried ever since. Seeing her today finally eased his longing. Yes. Eleanor Bennet lowered her head, avoiding his overly intense gaze at the moment. Why isn't Eunuch Liam here today? Edward King also seemed to notice the unfamiliar face at the Hall of Heavenly Purity and couldn't help but feel suspicious. Replying to Prince David, Eunuch Liam is ill. The eunuch bowed his head in response. Oh, please inform the Emperor, we brothers have come to pay our respects. Edward King said. At this moment, Edward King's mind was entirely on Eleanor Bennet, seemingly forgetting the purpose of entering the palace today. Replying to Prince David, the Emperor has decreed that he will not receive anyone today. The three princes, please return. Is the Emperor unwell? Richard King also curiously asked. The Emperor is in good health, I am merely following his orders. The eunuch's eyes flashed with a glimmer, but Eleanor Bennet caught it. Today, Eleanor Bennet felt the atmosphere at the Hall of Heavenly Purity was unusual. It seems Alexander King does not intend to meet anyone today. Fourth brother, fifth brother, let's return to the residence first. The Emperor is not even seeing Dr. Bennet today, surely there's nothing to worry about. Edward King said with a smile. Lord Bennet, let me escort you back to the Imperial Medical Institute. Edward King said to Eleanor Bennet. Third brother, fifth brother, and I will wait for you outside the palace. Edward King couldn't help but sigh. Since ancient times, heroes have struggled to resist beautiful women, and Eleanor Bennet was certainly Edward King's weakness. Edward King and Richard King left first. Their actions made it even harder for Eleanor Bennet to refuse, so she reluctantly walked slowly with Edward King towards the Imperial Medical Institute. Eleanor Bennet remained silent, her gaze lingering on the surrounding scenery. In the Imperial Gardens, a few peach trees had begun to sprout green buds, signaling the onset of spring. It is said that when spring arrives, the earth warms, and all living things thrive. Eleanor Bennet, would you care to take a walk by the Jade Lake with me? Edward King followed Eleanor Bennet's gaze and noticed the peach trees, thinking she must like this spring scene, and Jade Lake seemed a good choice. Eleanor Bennet hesitated. After all, he was a prince, and sometimes tact was necessary. I would be honored to accompany you. Eleanor Bennet replied respectfully. Edward King was naturally pleased. The two of them slowly made their way towards Jade Lake. The clear lake water flowed gently, and a light breeze created ripples on the surface. The breeze carried the vitality of the new spring, diminishing the winter's chill. Eleanor Bennet and Edward King reached the pavilion in the middle of the lake, gazing at the distant drooping willow branches, a vibrant green full of life. Eleanor Bennet, how is ninth brother's illness? Edward King asked hesitantly, and Eleanor Bennet immediately understood his concern. Your Highness, the prince's condition has improved, Eleanor Bennet replied calmly. Eleanor Bennet, no matter when, I will always protect you and the Bennet family. So, don't be too afraid of King Charles. Edward King unexpectedly stepped forward, gently holding Eleanor Bennet's soft hand, his expression sincere and deep, not at all feigned. I am grateful for your kindness towards the Bennet family, Your Highness. Eleanor Bennet understood that Edward King likely believed the Bennet family was threatened by Charles King, which is why he said these words. Eleanor Bennet did not want to exploit his feelings for her, but to guard against Charles King possibly turning his back on them in the future, she had to tactfully engage with Edward King to ensure the safety of the Bennet family. Edward King's words today brought her some comfort. She understood that being caught between Edward King and Charles King would be exhausting, but the survival of the Bennet family was a responsibility she could not shirk. Not for Arthur Bennet, but for the innocent lives of the Bennet family. Eleanor Bennet, I do not wish to force you, only hope you understand my sincere feelings. Even if we cannot spend a lifetime together, your place in my heart is irreplaceable. Edward King placed Eleanor Bennet's soft hand on his chest, his declaration truly heartfelt. Your Highness, I. At this moment, Eleanor Bennet didn't know what to say and was momentarily speechless. Her eyes glanced across the lake and she saw a vaguely familiar flower boat. Eleanor Bennet's expression became serious, as it seemed to be the boat on which Alexander King had specially summoned her. Thinking of the unfamiliar faces at the Hall of Heavenly Purity today and the Emperor's refusal to receive guests, Eleanor Bennet seemed to understand something. Could it be that the Emperor was not in the palace but here? In that instant, Eleanor Bennet sensed the mystery surrounding Alexander King. Could one of the two mysterious figures appearing at Serenity Palace last night be the Emperor? What secrets were hidden within this palace? Eleanor Bennet, what are you looking at? Edward King noticed Eleanor Bennet's unusual behavior and followed her gaze toward the middle of the lake. It's nothing, I was just distracted by some water birds, Eleanor Bennet smiled, subtly distancing herself from Edward King, appearing somewhat uneasy. Edward King seemed to notice the flower boat in the middle of the lake as well, but acted naturally. Concubine Florence is out rowing the boat again. An offhand remark by Edward King left Eleanor Bennet astonished. Is that the flower boat of Concubine Florence? Eleanor Bennet stood beside Edward King, deliberately asking with curiosity. Yes, Concubine Florence came from a brothel. My father fell for her on this very flower boat while patrolling the Manhwa River. Edward King's voice carried a hint of disdain and arrogance. Concubine Florence came from a brothel? Eleanor Bennet was genuinely surprised by this information. But she understood well that this flower boat likely belonged to someone else. You're surprised too, aren't you? Edward King said with a gentle smile. Just a bit astonished. Eleanor Bennet thought of Concubine Florence, not surprised that she felt Concubine Florence was different from the other concubines. Your Highness, how long has Concubine Florence been in the palace? Eleanor Bennet suddenly took an interest in this concubine Florence. "It's been 5 or 6 years now," Edward King replied. "She's been in the palace for so long and still favored. The Emperor and she are truly affectionate." Eleanor Bennet smiled, intentionally showing admiration. "Humph, women from brothels are best at enchanting men. My father is merely captivated by her beauty." Edward King seemed indifferent, clearly disliking concubine Florence. Eleanor Bennet didn't respond further. She understood why Edward King felt this way. Concubine Yun was once the emperor's favorite. Being the son of concubine Violet, he naturally resented all the women loved by the emperor. "Your Highness, I have some matters at the Imperial Medical Institute, please excuse me." Eleanor Bennet bowed and asked to leave. "Eleanor Bennet, next month on the 6th, the King Edward residence will hold a housewarming party, and I would like to invite you to attend." Edward King held Eleanor Bennet's hand, reluctant to let go. "Eleanor Bennet will attend with my father." Eleanor Bennet bowed and took her leave, leaving Edward King still lingering. Watching Eleanor Bennet depart, Edward King felt a warmth in his heart. Today, her attitude towards him was noticeably gentler than her usual indifference. This gave him hope once more that one day he might move her heart. Chapter 42, Possession. Eleanor Bennet left Jade Lake, her mind heavy with thoughts. Was Alexander King on the flower boat today? Who were the two masked figures that appeared at Serenity Palace last night? Eleanor Bennet recalled the injured masked figure. There was something familiar about their aura. Thinking of the word injured, she suddenly realized. Could it be that the masked figure was the emperor, and the reason for not seeing anyone today was due to his injury? Eleanor Bennet organized her thoughts, guessing a few possibilities. From their conversation, it wasn't hard to notice the deep-seated hatred spanning years. And who was the mysterious masked person? Years ago, Alexander King wasn't the heir to the throne, yet he managed to ascend as emperor, surely causing much bloodshed. The one with a grudge against the late Empress, this person must not be ordinary. Eleanor Bennet found herself back at the Imperial Medical Institute. "Greetings, Dr. Bennet." Theodore Sina noticed Eleanor Bennet seemed a bit absent-minded and quickly bowed. "Oh, it's Theodore Sina." Eleanor Bennet, lost in thought, was startled by the greeting. "Please, Theodore Sina, come in for some tea." Eleanor Bennet made way, inviting Theodore Sina inside. "Today, I must express my gratitude to Dr. Bennet for helping our department and saving Theodore. I am truly thankful." As soon as he entered the room, Theodore Sina hurriedly bowed in thanks. "Theodore Sina, there's no need for such formality. You have served in the palace for many years, and while you may not have achieved great merit, you have certainly endured hardships. It would be unfair to punish you just for a few decorative lamps." Eleanor Bennet poured tea, her voice tinged with indignation. "Oh, a servant is still just a servant. What merit could I possibly have?" Theodore Sina's voice carried a hint of helplessness mixed with some resentment. "Theodore Sina, you are a person of great virtue and prestige, and Eleanor Bennet holds you in high regard." Eleanor Bennet smiled warmly as she offered tea. "Dr. Bennet, you are wise and skilled in medicine, surely, your future will be filled with prosperity." Theodore Sina accepted the cup of tea. "Theodore Sina, you flatter me. Now, Eleanor Bennet will draw some lamp designs, please wait a moment." Eleanor Bennet left her seat and went to the desk. Theodore Sina expressed his gratitude once more, then sat quietly watching Eleanor Bennet as she began to draw. Eleanor Bennett sketched several lamp designs based on the principles of Kongming lanterns and handed them to Theodore Sina. As he examined them, a look of doubt crossed his face. "Dr. Bennett, isn't this design too simple?" Theodore Sina was surprised at how plain the lamp designs were, lacking any intricate patterns. "Theodore Sina, these lamps can be made with silk, but the lamp body must be light. Just follow Eleanor Bennett's design, and she will guide you through the process." Eleanor Bennett understood Theodore Sina's concerns. "Oh, in that case, I will go and start working on it immediately. I take my leave." Although Eleanor Bennett was slightly worried, she had witnessed Eleanor Bennett's exceptional intelligence, which was truly uncommon. Eleanor Bennett sees Theodore Sina out. Eleanor Bennett escorted him to the door of the Imperial Medical Institute. As the sunset painted the horizon, Eleanor Bennett suddenly thought of Daniel Moore. She wondered if he was feeling better. Standing amidst the twilight, she appeared so solitary. She was destined to be caught in this whirlpool of struggles, but Daniel Moore could escape it. Why should she drag another person into this suffering with her? If they were soulmates, how could she bear to let him be ensnared in this misery? Eleanor Bennett returned to her room, changed into her female attire, and headed towards Radiant Sun Gate. She still wished to see him once more, to offer her sincere apologies. Eleanor Bennett left the palace alone, walking for about an hour until she reached Harmony Hall. To her surprise, the shop was tightly closed. Standing on the stone steps, she gazed at the signboard, her heart heavy with worry. Had he returned to the snow mountains? Eleanor Bennett slowly walked along the street, watching the last rays of twilight disappear as the sky gradually darkened. The roadside stalls began to pack up, and the shops on both sides started closing. Cooking smoke lingered in the distance, and a crescent moon hung in the eastern sky. With a heavy heart, Eleanor Bennett returned to the Bennett residence. As soon as the servants saw her, they hurried inside to report. Eleanor Bennett had just reached the main hall when Arthur Bennett rushed out. "Eleanor, why are you home so late? Why didn't you inform the household so someone could pick you up?" Arthur Bennett looked at Eleanor Bennett, his face full of concern. "Today, there was nothing to do at the Imperial Medical Institute, so I came to visit you and Mother." Eleanor Bennett replied with a forced smile. "Ah, steward, have the kitchen prepare some of Eleanor's favorite dishes." Arthur Bennett instructed the steward, who nodded and left. "Father, I'm going to the Buddhist temple to visit Mother." Eleanor Bennett bowed to Arthur Bennett and headed towards the back courtyard. Mrs. Bennett was overjoyed to see Eleanor Bennett home. After asking her a few questions, she couldn't help but feel worried. "Mother, what's wrong?" Eleanor Bennett nestled against Mrs. Bennett's lap, acting playfully. "Eleanor, you're grown up now, it's time to think about marriage." "Mother, why bring this up?" "Eleanor, now that the Clark family has broken off the engagement, it's not ideal for a young lady like you. It's all because your father was greedy for wealth and insisted on canceling it. I'm truly worried now." Mrs. Bennett sighed, looking troubled. "Mother, I won't marry. I'll stay by your side." Eleanor Bennett reassured her, genuinely in no hurry to wed. "Silly girl, a woman eventually needs to find a safe haven. I can't let you miss your prime years. Mother, when it comes to love, I'll leave it to fate." Eleanor Bennett said cheerfully, unconcerned. "Madam, miss, dinner is ready," the butler called from outside the door. "Mother, let's go have dinner." Eleanor Bennett helped Mrs. Bennett out of the Buddhist temple, and they walked affectionately towards the dining room. Several maids were attending outside the hall. Arthur Bennet sat at the head of the table, sipping wine. "Father." Eleanor Bennet greeted him with a slight bow and then sat next to Mrs. Bennet. "Eleanor, all your favorite dishes are here. Eat plenty," Arthur Bennet said fondly. "Thank you, Father." Eleanor Bennet began eating, occasionally serving food to Mrs. Bennet. The family was harmonious and joyful. A servant hurriedly entered the dining room, whispered something to the butler, and quickly left. The butler stepped in to report. "Master, the steward from Prince Charles's residence is here to see you." "Oh? Invite him in." Arthur Bennet put down his chopsticks, rinsed his mouth, and went to the main hall. Hearing about Prince Charles's residence, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel tense. David King truly never let her have a moment's peace. Seeing the sky already dark, she suddenly understood. Tonight was a new moon night, and the steward must be here for her. "Eleanor, why aren't you eating anymore?" Mrs. Bennet asked, looking at Eleanor Bennet with concern. "Mother, perhaps Prince Charles's residence is requesting my assistance." "I've finished eating." Eleanor Bennet rinsed her mouth and prepared to head to the main hall. "Eleanor, I've heard that Prince Charles has a gloomy and peculiar temperament. You must be careful while attending to him," Lady Bennet said with concern. Prince Charles had been ill for over 10 years, and Eleanor Bennet's reputed miraculous medical skills were uncertain. Lady Bennet feared she might cause trouble. "Mother, I understand, please don't worry." "You should rest early," Eleanor Bennet reassured Lady Bennet before heading to the main hall. Eunuch Doan was having tea with Arthur Bennet and quickly paid his respects upon seeing Eleanor. "Dr. Bennet, we came to the palace to invite you, and only learned today that you returned home, so we hurried here," Eunuch Doan said respectfully. "Eunuch Doan, you're too kind. Is Prince Charles unwell?" Eleanor had already guessed she wouldn't be able to avoid this visit today. "Indeed, His Highness is unwell, which is why we are troubling you now. Dr. Bennet, please come with us." "All right. I will change and accompany you," Eleanor Bennet said, excusing herself to her room. Clara Young, aware that Eleanor had to visit the prince's residence, felt her good mood plummet. "Miss, why are you always in such a rush every time you return home?" Clara Young fetched a dark blue gown with a short jacket embroidered with golden flowers for Eleanor. She tied Eleanor's long hair into a simple bun with a magnolia wood hairpin, giving her an elegant look. "Miss, I heard Prince Charles has a strange personality, unpredictable like the weather. Please be careful." Clara Young, having heard rumors about Prince Charles, naturally worried for Eleanor. "Clara, don't worry. I'm just going to treat a patient." Eleanor thought of Charles King's icy face and couldn't help but feel helpless. "Miss, I still think Prince Edward is more approachable." Clara Young beamed with joy. "So, Clara, you fancy Prince Edward? Perhaps I should mention it to him and have him take you as a concubine?" Eleanor teased, causing Clara's cheeks to blush like an apple. "Miss, you're teasing me again," Clara exclaimed, covering her face in embarrassment. "All right, go get my medicine chest," Eleanor laughed. Clara brought the medicine chest, and they headed to the front hall. Eunuch Doan appeared anxious and quickly approached Eleanor as soon as he saw her. "You've waited long, Eunuch." Eleanor bowed respectfully. "Dr. Bennet, let's go." "I'm truly grateful for your help," Eunuch Doan said, his eyes lighting up at Eleanor's attire. The Bennet daughter was indeed a beauty, no wonder the prince treated her specially. "Eunuch, You're too courteous. I bid you farewell, Arthur Bennet said kindly. Master Bennet, please, Eunuch Doan smiled, stepping out with Arthur Bennet. Upon reaching the outside of the residence, she saw a finely crafted carriage accompanied by several dozen guards. Eleanor Bennet bid farewell to Arthur Bennet. Noticing the smug smile on his face, she could guess what he was thinking. Arthur Bennet must be feeling conflicted. Having to choose between King Edward and Duke Wing was indeed not easy. Eleanor Bennet boarded the carriage, her heart filled with disdain. Thinking of Mrs. Bennet's words today, she could only sigh helplessly. If she couldn't marry the one she wanted, she'd rather not marry at all. Using her as a political pawn was absolutely out of the question. Eleanor Bennet looked up at the sky outside the carriage. The faint crescent moon made her think of Charles King. Tonight would be another sleepless night. Resting her eyes in the carriage, she wondered if she could cure the soul silkworm poison in him. Would there be less entanglement between them? But she had no idea about this poison, fearing that their fate was destined to be intertwined. The carriage turned down several streets and stopped in front of the grand entrance of Duke Wing's residence. Several attendants holding lanterns hurried forward to serve. Hearing the commotion, Eleanor Bennet alighted from the carriage, led by Eunuch Young into the residence. Eleanor Bennet walked slowly down the corridor, noticing the direction seemed to lead to Bamboo Pavilion. She recalled there was a hot spring there. Could it be that Charles King was staying in the residence tonight instead of going to the bamboo forest? Eunuch Young led Eleanor Bennet to Bamboo Pavilion, and the attendants with lanterns immediately withdrew. A few attendants waiting outside quickly stepped forward to pay their respects. Is the Duke inside? Eunuch Young asked. Yes, steward, the Duke is dining, the attendant respectfully replied. All right. Dr. Bennet, I will report your arrival. Please wait here for a moment, Eunuch Young said before stepping into the courtyard. Eleanor Bennet looked at the lush green bamboo, wondering why David King was dining here today. At that moment, Eunuch Doan emerged, guiding Eleanor Bennet into the courtyard. Only then did Eleanor Bennet notice Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow standing outside the main hall. Several attendants hurriedly carried out food boxes, indicating that the people inside had finished dining. Dr. Bennet, the Duke only permits you to enter alone. I shall take my leave. Eunuch Doan's somewhat ambiguous smile made Eleanor Bennet uneasy. All the attendants in Bamboo Pavilion withdrew, leaving only Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow outside the main hall. Eleanor Bennet hesitated as she stepped inside, seeing David King seated leisurely on a soft chair in the study, casually reviewing some documents. Eleanor Bennet glanced around, noticing that everything seemed to have been replaced with his belongings. Could it be that he was always staying in Bamboo Pavilion? David King looked up at Eleanor Bennet, a flash of admiration in his eyes. Today she exuded an elegant, gentle, and refined aura. However, Eleanor Bennet didn't notice the change in his gaze, focusing instead on observing the items in the room. I greet the Duke, Eleanor Bennet said after standing for a moment, realizing he was ignoring her. She had to bow in respect. Inwardly, she thought, what trick is this sly fox trying to pull now? Did you go to Harmony Hall today? David King's eyes remained on the document, his voice indifferent. Did you send someone to follow me? Eleanor Bennet tensed at his question. All your actions are within my sight, so don't have any petty ideas. David King said smugly, tossing the document aside and sipping his tea. David King, you're despicable. Eleanor Bennet was somewhat angry, realizing she lived under his surveillance every day. How was this different from being imprisoned? Did he know about her visit to Ikuan Palace? I never intended to be a gentleman. David King seemed unfazed. Eleanor Bennet didn't want to continue arguing pointlessly with him, so she sat at the far end of the round table. You forced Daniel Moore to leave the capital, didn't you? Eleanor Bennet asked, a bit disappointed. Eleanor Bennet, he suffered because of you. David King felt an inexplicable annoyance when she mentioned Daniel Moore. David King, one day I'll escape your clutches. Eleanor Bennet looked at him with determination, causing David King to feel uneasy. That day will never come, woman. You should give up hope. David King spoke confidently, yet a sense of panic rose within him. No one knows what the future holds. David King, you're too confident. Eleanor Bennet knew she couldn't do much now, but her hope would never be extinguished. Eleanor Bennet, don't think of using Edward King against me, he's no match for me. He had guessed her intentions. In terms of despicability and cold-bloodedness, he's indeed no match for you. Every meeting was filled with arguments, as if he was born to oppose her. Do you know the consequences of angering me? David King stood up from the bed, his gaze cold as he warned Eleanor Bennet. David King, I've told you, stop threatening me. Eleanor Bennet refused to back down, addressing him directly. Charles King stepped forward, grasping Eleanor Bennet's chin, looking deeply into her eyes. She sensed an ambiguous tension filling the room. She wanted to resist, but the grip on her neck tightened. This woman, I miss her. Charles King's voice held a hint of gentleness. Suddenly, he leaned down to kiss Eleanor Bennet passionately. She couldn't believe her ears. Did he really say he missed her? How could those words come from him? Her eyes were filled with shock, leaving her unable to resist his kiss. He couldn't possibly like her, could he? It must be some cruel twist of fate. Eleanor Bennet screamed internally, her mind blank. Eleanor Bennet, you'll never escape me in this lifetime. Charles King released her lips, lifting her and moving towards the bed. Charles King, what are you planning? Eleanor Bennet snapped back to reality. Was he going to? She dared not think further. Before she could react, he laid her on the bed. Charles King gently caressed her smooth, jade-like skin, greedily inhaling her scent. Charles King, can you stop acting so presumptuously? I'd rather die than be your woman. Eleanor Bennet was somewhat frightened, convinced he was toying with her. Eleanor Bennet, no one has ever dared to defy me. Are you sure you want to be the first? Charles King was furious. It was the first time he had feelings for a woman, yet he was continually rejected. With his status, having a woman was usually easy. But this woman was not like the others. Charles King, I am not an object, nor do I belong to anyone. Even if you are the emperor, you cannot force me to do what I do not want. I will not be your woman, so abandon that idea. Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King, who was so angry his hair seemed to stand on end, knowing she was playing with fire. Eleanor Bennet, you have no other choice. Charles King moved closer to Eleanor Bennet, whispering in her ear. Charles King, if you like a soulless, emotionless shell, then I have nothing more to say. Eleanor Bennet closed her eyes, accepting that what was coming could not be avoided. Humph! This woman, you will regret it. Charles King angrily stood up and unexpectedly left the room. Eleanor Bennet sat up, adjusting her disheveled clothes. Today, she won thanks to his arrogance. Did he really like her? Eleanor Bennet still couldn't believe it. Yet, a small thrill stirred within her. She couldn't clarify these mixed emotions. She admitted that the feelings he evoked in her were unique. It was a kind of heartache mixed with melancholy, especially when his cold affliction flared up. His helplessness and loneliness made her want to defy everything. Could this be love? Eleanor Bennet shook her head, repeatedly telling herself it was only pity for him, definitely not love. She needed to quickly find a way to cure his ailment, heal him, and sever all ties. Once she cured him, she would no longer feel pity, and those strange emotions would disappear. Eleanor Bennet consoled herself, trying not to let her thoughts wander. She continually reminded herself that Charles King only saw her as an object of possession tonight. It was not affection, much less love, just mere possession. She must not fall into it, absolutely not. Eleanor Bennet lay helplessly on the bed, feeling extremely frustrated. Dealing with Edward King alone was already a headache, and now with Charles King added to the mix, how could her life possibly continue? Chapter 43, Ice Soul Silkworm Poison. Why are you sighing so heavily, young lady? A sudden voice echoed in the room. Eleanor Bennet was startled but then recognized the visitor. It was Grandmaster Anthony, with his silver hair and black robe, calmly sipping tea on the opposite chair. You scared me, Eleanor Bennet exclaimed, trying to calm herself as she rubbed her chest. You were just lost in thought. It's not this old man's fault, Grandmaster Anthony smiled. Weren't you supposed to have returned to the Snow Mountains? Eleanor Bennet was surprised to see him at Prince Charles's residence. I was worried about that kid, Charles King. Daniel, he... Eleanor Bennet hesitated, unsure whether to ask. Don't worry, young lady, Daniel is fine. But it's you who makes this old man a bit uneasy. What do you mean by that? Eleanor Bennet was puzzled, wondering why he would be concerned about her. Do you have feelings for Daniel? Sir, Eleanor Bennet was taken aback by his direct question and didn't know how to respond. Although she and Daniel Moore were very close, they lacked the romantic spark. They were more suited to be confidants. I can see that Daniel has feelings for you. Daniel grew up in the Snow Mountains, with a peaceful temperament, not suited for the scheming capital. If you have feelings for him, I'll support you both in leaving this noisy place. But if you don't have romantic feelings for him, it's best not to drag him into this murky situation. Grandmaster Anthony's words were sincere, filled with care for Daniel. Eleanor didn't want an innocent person to be caught up in this turmoil. She realized she had been selfish before. I understand, sir. I only see Daniel as a confidant, with no romantic feelings, Eleanor Bennet replied, feeling a pang of sadness and helplessness. I know you're a sensible and understanding child. You can control the ice soul silkworm poison, this is fate. You and Charles are destined. I hope you can take good care of Charles. Grandmaster Anthony's expression showed doubt, and his words carried a plea. Sir, he and I. Eleanor Bennet was at a loss for words. They were indeed connected, but certainly not in a positive way. Charles is not inherently sinister or suspicious, it's the trauma from 10 years ago that deeply hurt him. Coupled with the cold poison and the scheming palace life, it has made him the solitary, cold person he is today. You're the first he has cared for, so if you have feelings for him, don't let him down. Sir, it's not as simple as you think between us. There's no affection, Eleanor Bennet clarified, knowing Grandmaster Anthony misunderstood. Sir, what exactly is the ice soul silkworm poison? Eleanor Bennet changed the subject, knowing further discussion would complicate matters. The ice soul silkworm poison is a type of venom bred by the Faktu tribe in the western reaches. It's named for its transparent body, resembling a silkworm, cold as ice, and white as snow. How can it survive in the human body? Eleanor Bennett listened to Grandmaster Anthony's explanation, realizing it was a type of parasite. It survives by absorbing the host's vital essence. The host's body becomes icy cold, just like it. However, on each new moon, it moves throughout the blood, causing excruciating pain down to the bones, Grandmaster Anthony said, gazing at the rising new moon, deep in thought. According to you, this creature won't kill the host? Eleanor Bennett recalled Charles King's painful episodes, feeling a deep sympathy. Only temporarily. Once it matures, it will invade the heart's veins, and the host will die as a result. Doesn't that mean Charles King will? Eleanor Bennett couldn't help but worry about him. 10 years ago, Charles began practicing the Radiant Sun Divine Art, a method of pure yang, which has protected his heart's veins over the years. But it can't completely eliminate the ice soul silkworm. Thus, every new moon, he endures the bone-deep pain, and his power is temporarily sealed. Eleanor Bennett suddenly realized why she had sensed a chaotic energy within him before. Last time, when Charles King coughed up blood, it must have been due to the energy disruption. Is there nothing that can counter the ice soul silkworm? Everything in the world has its opposite, such an extremely cold entity should have a counter. There is something, but it's only a legend. It's said that in the land of molten lava grows a plant called the crimson blaze herb. Its roots grow in hot springs, and its fruit is extremely hot. Consuming it can increase the body's yang energy, immediately softening the soul silkworm poison. However, it's exceedingly rare and hard to find, and its intense heat is not something ordinary people can endure. So without this crimson blaze herb, is there no way to cure Charles King's poison? Eleanor Bennett felt a bit disappointed, realizing Charles King might not be cured. I've tried countless remedies, but I know very little about this one. We can only leave it to fate. The old hermit sighed and left the room. Where are you going? Eleanor Bennett asked, noticing his disappointed expression. Miss, how do you control the cold energy in Charles's body? The old hermit suddenly remembered something and turned to ask Eleanor Bennett. I only use acupuncture to numb his consciousness. It doesn't resolve the cold poison in his body. Your medical skills are quite remarkable, the old hermit mused, smiling as he walked into the courtyard. Eleanor Bennett followed, noticing Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow were no longer there. They must have gone to protect Charles King. If someone wanted to harm him, it would be the perfect time when he's poisoned. Eleanor Bennett suddenly understood why Charles King always secretly went to the bamboo forest. He likely feared someone would take advantage. Grandmaster Anthony and Eleanor Bennett arrived at the hot spring behind Bamboo Pavilion, where they saw Charles King soaking in the pool. Eleanor Bennett looked up at the new moon, sensing the critical moment was near. Weren't you supposed to return to the Snow Mountains? Charles King asked Grandmaster Anthony, slightly displeased. Afraid I'll interrupt your romance? Grandmaster Anthony teased, glancing at Eleanor Bennett, making her feel uncomfortable. Sir, I'll go back to Bamboo Pavilion to get the medicine box. Eleanor Bennett made an excuse and quickly left. Charles King watched Eleanor Bennett's departing figure, still angry about the earlier incident. She must have feelings for Daniel Moore. He couldn't think of any other reason for her refusal. Charles, Jose King has returned to the capital. Grandmaster Anthony's eyes turned serious as he looked at Charles King in the water, his face full of concern. Blood Shadow. Charles King's voice was filled with intense hostility. At your service. Blood Shadow knelt behind the curtain, awaiting orders. Mobilize all the death warriors of the Cold Shadow sect. This time, I must see Jose King's head. David King gritted his teeth in hatred, his inner energy beginning to become chaotic. David, the Cold Shadow sect is no match for Jose King. Don't make unnecessary sacrifices. Grandmaster Anthony worried that his fears had come true. I have what I have today because of him. Master, do you want me to spare him? David King looked at Grandmaster Anthony with doubt, his reason overtaken by hatred. David, now is really not the right time. The Cold Shadow sect was built by your own hands. Do you really want it to turn to ashes? Grandmaster Anthony advised. David King fell into deep thought, but his body began to tremble. Grandmaster Anthony quickly noticed something was wrong, hurriedly stepped forward to check his pulse, and loudly exclaimed that something was amiss. Blood Shadow, quickly call Miss Bennett. Grandmaster Anthony ordered Blood Shadow, while he immediately supported David King to the shore, transferring his inner energy to him. When Eleanor Bennett rushed over, she saw Grandmaster Anthony sitting cross-legged, transferring energy to David King. David King's forehead was covered in sweat, and his lips had turned blue. Eleanor Bennett quickly took out her acupuncture needles, intending to step forward and perform acupuncture, but Blood Shadow stopped her. Lady Bennett, you mustn't. Eleanor Bennett looked at Blood Shadow in confusion, not understanding his meaning. Lady Bennett, the Master is transferring energy to the Lord. If you intervene now, it will surely cause harm. Blood Shadow explained. Eleanor Bennett stood still, not daring to approach. She couldn't comprehend the principles of the ancient internal energy techniques. At this moment, from another part of the royal residence, sounds of fighting erupted. Eleanor Bennett suspected that there might be intruders. Seeing Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow remain calm, she felt somewhat reassured. The sounds of fighting lasted for about an hour before gradually subsiding. At this point, Grandmaster Anthony withdrew his energy and weakly stood up. Master, are you all right? Eleanor Bennett quickly stepped forward to inquire. Girl, first check on Charles. Grandmaster Anthony was still worried as he looked at Charles King. During this energy transfer, he discovered that the power of the Ice Soul Snow Silkworm had become even stronger than before. Eleanor Bennett checked the pulse and discovered that the inner strength within his body had increased significantly. It seems that Grandmaster Anthony had transferred a considerable amount of inner power to him. Once certain he was not in danger, Eleanor Bennett performed acupuncture to relieve pain. At this moment, Charles King was unconscious, his body as cold as ice. Young lady, I entrust Charles to you. Grandmaster Anthony's cryptic words made Eleanor Bennett feel a heavy burden. Grandmaster Anthony left the manor, disappearing into the night. The crescent moon gradually set in the west, and the cold aura surrounding Charles King slowly dissipated. Eleanor Bennett gently wiped the sweat from his forehead, covered him with a fur coat, and silently gazed at his serene face, feeling as if a lifetime had passed. Charles King, how can I rid you of the cold poison? Eleanor Bennett softly brushed his long eyebrows, a growing sense of compassion welling up inside her. This woman, I have never dared to hope for such things. Why burden yourself with these worries? Charles King's unexpected reply startled Eleanor Bennett. Looking at him, her previously anxious heart began to calm. Charles King, every situation has a chance for change. Why not give yourself a little hope? Eleanor Bennett sensed the sorrow in his words. He must have understood that if he couldn't eliminate the ice soul snow toxin, he would ultimately succumb to death from the cold invading his heart. Eleanor Bennet sighed. The person who poisoned him was truly malicious, not only causing pain but also intending to take his life. Eleanor Bennet, my world does not require hope. Charles King stood up and stepped into the hot spring. Watching his desolate figure, Eleanor Bennet felt her heart waver, her mind adrift. Master. At this moment, Shadow appeared from nowhere, kneeling outside the curtain. How has the matter been handled? David King leaned against the pool, his gaze directed outward. Master, David King has been rescued from the manor. Eleanor Bennet was astonished to hear this, looking at David King. He had indeed followed her advice. Make sure Phantom leaves no trace. If any records are found, kill David King immediately. Shadow received the order and departed. Blood Shadow, report to the Emperor, saying that tonight an assassin infiltrated the Duke's manor, attempted to assassinate me, leaving me seriously injured and temporarily unable to handle state affairs. David King noticed Eleanor Bennet's surprised expression and smiled knowingly. David King, did you really let David King go? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but ask as Blood Shadow left. You were the one who told me to give him a sliver of hope, and now you're questioning me? The words are true, but have you considered the risks involved? Eleanor Bennet was worried because David King wasn't the only one seeking the records. Clearly, this was a dangerous move. How can you catch a tiger cub without entering the tiger's den? I am determined to succeed. Eleanor Bennet watched David King, his calm demeanor and arrogant aura exuding the presence of a true sovereign. Eleanor Bennet stood by the pool, looking towards the increasingly bright eastern horizon. Even the darkness before dawn could not compare to the light of the rising sun. All the night shadows would vanish under its radiance. David, let me tell you a story. Eleanor Bennet sat by the lake opposite him, removed her shoes and socks, and dipped her delicate feet into the warm water. If you don't mind, tell me. Charles King looked at her with a relaxed expression, a rare mischievous and natural look in his eyes. Eleanor Bennet slowly recounted the story of the struggle between Carter and Han to Charles King. She always felt that Charles King had the talent of an emperor but lacked a heart that loved the people. By telling him the story of Chu and Han, she hoped he would understand the importance of gaining the way, having many allies, losing the way, having no allies. Eleanor Bennet knew she couldn't change the entire society's structure, but if a brilliant ruler could emerge, it would be a blessing for the people. By the time Eleanor Bennet finished the story, the sun had risen high in the east. The bright sunlight illuminated every corner of the royal residence, casting dappled shadows that swayed with the wind. Eleanor Bennet, where did you hear this story? Charles King, this isn't just a story, it's history. Just in a different time and place. Xiang Yu, the king of Chu, truly was a hero. Even in defeat, he remained honorable. Charles King couldn't help but admire. He was a hero, but not a wise leader. Eleanor Bennet said candidly, hoping he would understand. Eleanor Bennet, if you were Yu, would you choose King Carter or Han Emperor Liu Bang? Eleanor Bennet didn't expect Charles King to ask such a question and could only look at him in surprise for a long time. If I were Yu, I would also choose King Carter. Not for any other reason, but because of the love King Carter had for Yu, a lifetime commitment, never parting. Eleanor Bennet looked at the lush purple bamboo forest in Bamboo Garden, expressing her steadfastness in love. David King, hearing Eleanor Bennet's words, fell into contemplation. A lifetime commitment, never parting, was that her expectation of love? It seemed somewhat unrealistic, yet it was a beautiful dream. Servant greets your highness. Eunuch Don, who had been waiting outside the curtain with a group of people, greeted them. Eleanor Bennet stood up, put on her shoes and socks, preparing to leave. She and David King had talked a lot. Tonight was their most harmonious night ever. That woman, have breakfast with me, there's a play I need you to perform. David King stepped out of the water, and Eleanor Bennet quickly retreated behind the curtain to avoid him, while several eunuchs hurriedly dressed him. In a moment, the handsome man, dressed in brocade robes and a golden hat, emerged as if from a painting. It wasn't the first time Eleanor Bennet was captivated by his handsome appearance, and though she wasn't one to be swayed by looks, who doesn't appreciate beauty? What play do you want me to perform with you? Eleanor Bennet followed behind him and asked. It will be clear soon. Becca, go prepare breakfast. Charles King ordered Becca, who was beside him. I will prepare it immediately, but please instruct me, Your Highness, where should breakfast be served? Becca respectfully replied. Becca, I think you're getting muddled. Charles King's eyes glinted coldly, causing Becca to kneel in fear. I understand. Please calm your anger, Your Highness. Becca quickly retreated. Eleanor Bennet noticed the fear in Becca's eyes and couldn't help but wonder why breakfast was such a complicated matter. Woman, follow me. Charles King headed towards the bamboo pavilion. Eleanor Bennet followed him, unsure of what he was planning. As they entered the room, Eleanor Bennet saw several rolls of clean cotton cloth and a pair of scissors on the table. Charles King, what are you up to now? She asked, puzzled. Bandaging, of course. Charles King replied simply. Huh? Eleanor Bennet was surprised and a bit confused. Last night I was injured by an assassin, so naturally, I need treatment. Isn't this your specialty? Eleanor Bennet finally understood the act Charles King was putting on was for this reason. Acting is fine, but you should tell me who the audience is. Eleanor Bennet sat at the tea table. You'll know soon enough. Charles King was clearly being secretive, and Eleanor Bennet knew asking further would be useless. So where does Your Highness want to be injured? Eleanor Bennet asked, playing with the bandage pieces while Charles King sat calmly in his chair. Just like your last time, the more serious, the better. Charles King fiddled with a jade pendant. Eleanor Bennet approached him, pulled down his right sleeve, wrapped the bandage several times, and finally hung it around his neck. At that moment, Becca led a few eunuchs in, placing down exquisite food boxes before quickly leaving. Your Highness, breakfast is ready. Becca stood respectfully, waiting for Charles King's orders. Everyone, leave. Charles King walked to the round table, ordering all the eunuchs to depart. Woman, aren't you going to serve me breakfast? Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet, who stood still. You have hands and feet, why make me serve you? Eleanor Bennet, displeased, sat down at the table to eat on her own. I'm injured. Charles King deliberately emphasized the word injured. You. Eleanor Bennet was speechless, realizing what it meant to reap what you sow. She reluctantly picked up a bowl of bird's nest porridge, annoyed, and fed it to Charles King. It's too hot. Charles King deliberately made it difficult for her. Eleanor Bennet, resigned, blew on it to cool it down. This porridge is too sweet, switch to the orchid cake. Charles King refused to eat after she had just cooled it. Charles King, are you doing this on purpose? Eleanor Bennet fumed, placing the bowl down hard. She had never served anyone, and he was making it difficult. Eleanor Bennet, I am doing it on purpose, so what? Charles King smirked, finding her angry demeanor quite endearing. Eat by yourself, I'm not in the mood to serve you. Eleanor Bennet was exhausted from his summons last night, missing a good dinner, and now she was both hungry and tired. She decided to focus on her own hunger first. Woman, you tied my right hand, how am I supposed to eat? Charles King frowned at Eleanor Bennet's unrefined eating manner. She no longer had the demeanor of a noble lady. That's simple. Eleanor Bennet smiled, removing the bandage from his neck. All right, that's enough. Eleanor Bennet glared at him, continuing to enjoy her delicious meal, unbothered by Charles King's evident anger. Your Highness, the Emperor's carriage has left the main gate. At that moment, a eunuch reported from outside the door. Okay, tell the chief eunuch to wait at East Gardens. I will head there immediately. The eunuch left with the order, and several others quickly entered to attend to Charles King. Eleanor Bennet realized that Charles King's act was meant for Alexander King. She hurriedly bandaged Charles King and left Bamboo Pavilion with him. Chapter 44, Borrowing a knife to kill. The two arrived at East Gardens, where Eunuch Lee was waiting outside. Eleanor Bennet followed him into the room, noting the interior's resemblance to the Hall of Morning Flowers. Several eunuchs helped Charles King onto the bed and then withdrew. Charles King, aren't you afraid they'll accidentally reveal that you're not injured? Eleanor Bennet looked worriedly at the eunuchs outside. With so many people, wasn't he aware of the risk? Don't worry, they are all death soldiers of the Cold Shadow sect. Charles King's words surprised Eleanor Bennet. What is the Cold Shadow sect? Eleanor Bennet recalled meeting Simon Carter at the brothel, where he had been visibly terrified, indicating his fear of the Cold Shadow sect. Knowing too much isn't good for you, woman. Charles King warned her with a glance. Eleanor Bennet glared back, choosing to remain silent. Eleanor Bennet sat in the outer room, separated from Charles King by a pearwood screen painted with bamboo. She realized Charles King seemed to have a fondness for bamboo. The hot springs and bamboo pavilion both bore traces of this noble plant. Looking at the screen, she was reminded of the screen depicting a beauty in Serenity Palace. The beauty's features bore some resemblance to Charles King. Could the person in the painting be the late Empress? Your Highness, Eleanor Bennet hesitated, wanting to ask about Serenity Palace but fearing it might touch on Charles King's painful memories. Eleanor Bennet, since when did you become so formal? Charles King noticed her awkward tone and use of honorifics. It's nothing. Eleanor Bennet decided not to ask, as speaking too much could lead to mistakes. Charles King quietly leaned against the soft cushion. Eleanor Bennet thought he had fallen asleep since he wasn't moving. Feeling tired, she rested her head on the table, staring blankly at the distant face. How much longer would she have to stay at Prince Charles's residence? In the quiet room, she recalled Grandmaster Anthony's words from the previous night and couldn't help but feel sympathy for Charles King's fate. Losing his mother early, carrying a rare poison, enduring countless hardships, yet ultimately unable to escape death. Such a fate made it difficult to find happiness. Eunuch Owen entered and reported, Your Grace, the Emperor's carriage has arrived outside the residence. Eleanor Bennet was startled and stood up, looking towards Charles King, who remained silent. Everyone in the residence prepared to greet him. Charles King's voice remained calm as he continued sitting on the bed. Eleanor Bennet stood by the table, appearing somewhat awkward. After a moment, she heard hurried footsteps outside, knowing that Alexander King had arrived. Alexander King hurriedly entered and immediately saw Eleanor Bennet kneeling in greeting. "Your subject greets the Emperor." Eleanor Bennet bowed her head, deliberately avoiding his gaze. "Eleanor Bennet, how is Charles's condition?" Seeing Eleanor Bennet, Alexander King's tense expression seemed to ease slightly. "Your Majesty, the Duke is resting inside, and his injuries are not life-threatening for now." Eleanor Bennet couldn't discern Charles King's intentions, so she could only follow his instructions. "Charles." Alexander King went inside to check on Charles King's injuries, with Eleanor Bennet closely following. "Father, I am gravely injured and unable to greet you, please forgive me." Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King's weak appearance and couldn't help but think to herself, he really knows how to put on an act. "Charles, take good care of your injuries. Eunuch Liam, convey my decree, order the Nine Gates commander to find the assassin who attacked the king within 10 days, or be removed from office. Quickly deploy the royal guard to protect Prince Charles's residence. Any negligence will be severely punished." Alexander King was extremely angry, for such an incident to occur right under the emperor's nose indicated the capital's defenses were alarmingly weak. "Your servant obeys." Eunuch Liam quickly withdrew. "Eleanor Bennet, I entrust Charles's medical treatment to you. I trust in your abilities." Alexander King looked over, and Eleanor Bennet quickly knelt to accept the order. Eleanor Bennet glanced at Charles King lying on the bed. "Such a grand display, who exactly is he targeting?" "Father, the fact that the assassin chose the night of the new moon to attack me suggests they are no ordinary person." Charles King seemed to imply something, and Alexander King's expression immediately turned serious. "Everyone, leave." Alexander King ordered everyone in the room to leave. Eleanor Bennet bowed and exited, filled with doubt. Alexander King's change in expression upon hearing about the new moon indicated he knew about Charles King's secret poison. The performance Charles King put on today, who is it ultimately aimed at? Clearly, he intends to use others to achieve his own ends. Eleanor Bennet waited outside the room, unable to comprehend the situation. But she was certain that this matter was related to the events 10 years ago. Inside the room, Alexander King appeared deep in thought. "Charles, do you think it was him?" Alexander King asked. "Father, I received news that he has arrived in the capital." Charles King replied coldly. "I have already met him." Alexander King's voice carried a hint of helplessness. "Father, I must take his head." Charles King's fierce expression was identical to Alexander King's. "Charles, you are my treasure, nothing can go wrong with you. The Bryn Kingdom relies on you, so you must not act impulsively. Can you leave this matter to me?" Alexander King said with a heavy heart. "Father, I don't know how much longer I'll live. I just hope to see the blood of my enemy before I die," Charles King said, coughing, as painful memories resurfaced. "Charles, there must be a cure for the poison in you. Eleanor Bennet is your hope. I promise you, we will kill him," Alexander King said, supporting Charles King with a sorrowful expression. "Someone, come." Seeing Charles King weaken, Alexander King urgently called out. "What are your orders, Your Majesty?" Eunuch Liam quickly entered. "Fetch Dr. Bennet immediately," Alexander King said, worriedly watching Charles King. Eleanor Bennet, hearing Alexander King's summons, quickly entered. Eleanor Bennet, check Prince Charles's condition. Urged by Alexander King, Eleanor Bennet examined him. Apart from the cold aura, he was fine. Your Majesty, the prince has only lost too much blood and needs rest. Eleanor Bennet frowned, continuing the charade. Eleanor Bennet, stay at Prince Charles's residence for the next few days. His health is in your hands. Eleanor Bennet accepted the order with a sigh. Charles, rest well. Let me handle everything. I'll visit you later, Alexander King said. Farewell, father. Charles King replied. Farewell, your Majesty. Eleanor Bennet quickly knelt as Alexander King prepared to leave. Hearing his footsteps fade, she knew he had left. Charles King, you act well. Eleanor Bennet glanced at him. We're equally matched. Charles King returned to his previous demeanor. Charles King, this is treason. Eleanor Bennet said with some concern. Are you scared, woman? Of course, treason can lead to the extermination of one's family. So you do fear? Charles King's words were laced with mockery. Who are you targeting this time, Charles King? Eleanor Bennet asked directly, avoiding further argument. Woman, it's best not to know some things. Charles King remained tight-lipped. I've helped you with this act, at least let me die knowing why. Eleanor Bennet, now inextricably linked to him, couldn't escape the charge of treason. Eleanor Bennet, as long as you don't betray me, I will ensure your family's safety, Charles King said, removing the bandage from his hand. Who poisoned you? Eleanor Bennet pressed on. Do you really want to know? Charles King's eyes were cold, warning her. Yes, I want to know. Eleanor Bennet met his gaze, resolute. Woman, this is a forbidden topic in Britain. Are you sure you want to know? Charles King asked again. Charles King, I've reviewed the medical records of concubine Violet and the former Empress. Their deaths were too strange, making me suspect there's more to it. Eleanor Bennet understood Charles King's warning but was determined to uncover the truth. She was certain the ice silk poison on him was connected. What did you find out from the pulse records? Charles King appeared astonished. Concubine Violet and the former Empress must have died from poisoning. Eleanor Bennet expressed her suspicion. Are you really sure? Charles King was somewhat agitated, stepping forward to grasp Eleanor Bennet's soft hand. Not very sure, it's been many years, and I'm only judging based on the records. Eleanor Bennet looked a bit fearful at David King, as if he wasn't entirely aware of his mother's cause of death. You may leave now. I'm tired. David King released Eleanor Bennet, ordering her to leave. Sensing his unease, Eleanor Bennet could only let it go, planning her next move. As she stepped out, Steward Dunn approached her. Dr. Bennet, the prince has ordered you to temporarily stay at Bamboo Pavilion. Thank you, steward. Eleanor Bennet glanced at the tightly closed door, then followed a few attendants back to Bamboo Pavilion. After having dinner at Bamboo Pavilion, Eleanor Bennet strolled around the courtyard. Somehow, she found herself at the hot spring behind the estate. As the sky darkened, the entire manor was illuminated brightly. She lifted her dress, removed her shoes and socks, and sat by the pond, soaking her delicate feet in the water. Eleanor Bennet looked up at the brilliantly clear starry sky. The ancient air was so pure, allowing her to see so many stars. Taking a deep breath, she felt good and began to sing. Chapter 44, He Has Fallen for the Lonely Spirit. March 4th, you continue your life in a corner of the rain, filled with fascination for this world. A voice echoes then stops within, like sea breezes blending with the heartbeat. Rain remains a puzzle teasing humans. You are passing through layers of clouds, before you can ponder, love gently has nowhere to hide. Time inherently has no anchor. True love turns into raindrops, yet the rain drenches our aprons. Dreams now materialize, concealing an enticing labyrinth, everything is just a landscape. Before waking, joy, anger, love, and sorrow intertwine, tears mix with rain. Hidden within is the answer for everyone. You are passing through layers of clouds, before you can ponder, love gently has nowhere to hide. Eleanor Bennet's clear voice resonated, unaware that Charles King had been standing behind her. He listened to the unfamiliar melody, her melodious voice spreading throughout the curtains, captivating him. Perhaps she really isn't Eleanor Bennet. What would her world be like? After finishing her song, Eleanor Bennet suddenly remembered many old memories. Her heart felt a bit melancholic, and her eyes drifted to the water's surface. Charles King watched Eleanor Bennet transition from joy to sorrow. What's bothering her now? What is your name? Charles King suddenly wanted to know her other name. Eleanor Bennet turned around in surprise, seeing Charles King standing behind her. When did he arrive? What did you say? Eleanor Bennet asked in astonishment. You're not Eleanor Bennet, so what's your real name? Charles King sat down next to her, mimicking her by taking off his shoes and socks, letting his feet soak in the water. Eleanor Bennet was astonished by his actions, unable to believe her eyes. Was this really Charles King? Charles King, what's wrong with you today? Eleanor Bennet still thought she was hallucinating. Girl, how long do you intend to play dumb? Charles King sounded a bit displeased. Hearing this tone, Eleanor Bennet sighed in relief. It was indeed Charles King. My name is Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet recalled the incident that day in the pavilion, surprised that Charles King believed her. Eleanor Bennet. Charles King silently repeated these 3 words in his mind, glancing at Eleanor Bennet's clear eyes. Charles King, do you really believe me? I only believe that you're not the real Eleanor Bennet, because the real Eleanor Bennet wouldn't know medicine, wouldn't be able to sing the song you just performed, and certainly wouldn't have such a unique personality as you do. Actually, even I can't believe it. I wish it were all just a dream. When I wake up, I would just be lying on my spring bed. I never had a car accident, never traveled through time, and never met you. A shimmering tear fell from Eleanor Bennet's sorrowful eyes, dropping into the water and creating small ripples. Eleanor Bennet, do you really not want to meet me that much? Charles King listened to her last words, feeling an unnamed pain rising inside him. Eleanor Bennet didn't know how to respond. She was truly afraid of him, wary of him, and even held some resentment towards him. But after learning everything he had been through, her heart couldn't help but feel compassion. All previous grievances disappeared. Just thinking about his tragic fate when the cold invaded his heart made her panic, as if an unbearable pain was crushing her heart. Eleanor Bennet looked at him, her emotions in turmoil. Charles King kissed her. An indescribable emotion suddenly surged within her, and for the first time, she responded to Charles King's somewhat possessive kiss. She didn't want to develop feelings for him, but at this moment, she was truly captivated and enchanted by him. Her heart gradually sank deeper into his kiss. Chapter 44, He Loves a Lonely Soul, 4/4, Eleanor Bennet, don't ever leave me in this lifetime, okay? Charles King held Eleanor Bennet's face in his hands, his eyes shining with a glimmer of hope. Eleanor Bennet looked into his sorrowful eyes, feeling a heart-wrenching pain. Now, he resembled a wounded fawn, powerless to change the final outcome of death. Charles King, as long as we find the crimson blaze herb we can cure the poison within you. Don't give up hope. Eleanor Bennet tightly embraced the weakened Charles King, and in this moment, she suddenly had the thought of never leaving him. For the first time, she felt warmth emanating from a lonely, cold heart. Grandmaster Anthony was not wrong, his true nature was not like that. Who would have thought that the infamous sinister Duke would have such a gentle side? From the rooftop, a masked figure in black appeared, looking down at Charles King and Eleanor Bennet embracing by the lake. Eleanor Bennet immediately recognized the person as the man who had appeared at Serenity Palace. Charles King pulled Eleanor Bennet into his arms protectively, his gaze coldly fixed on the intruder. I was worried I wouldn't find you, but here you are, saving me quite a bit of trouble. Charles King remained seated, but Eleanor Bennet could sense the intense aura of menace emanating from him. Charles King, you dared to risk treason to force me out. If I didn't show up, wouldn't that waste your efforts? As soon as the words were spoken, the masked man hurled a dart at Eleanor Bennet. Charles King reacted swiftly, pushing Eleanor Bennet to the ground to avoid the hidden attack. The masked man was astonished at Charles King's concern for a woman. Stay behind the curtain, don't come out. Charles King whispered to Eleanor Bennet before leaping outside. Eleanor Bennet had witnessed the masked man's martial arts before and was worried for Charles King's safety. It turned out that the entire scenario today was orchestrated for this masked man. Charles King ascended to the rooftop to confront him. You young one, it seems Grandmaster Anthony has taught you quite a few techniques. The masked man dodged one of Charles King's strikes, his body soaring into the trees. Stop with the nonsense, today I will take your head. Charles King charged forward, engaging in dozens of rounds of combat. Even Alexander King is no match for me, you're just courting death. The masked man grew furious, his moves becoming increasingly rapid. Eleanor Bennet watched anxiously from below as the two battled on the rooftop. It was clear that the masked man had initially held back against Charles King, but now, using his full strength, Charles King was clearly outmatched. Eleanor Bennet was extremely worried. Why hadn't Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow appeared? Could the masked man have already dealt with them? Charles King, be careful! Eleanor Bennet shouted as she saw a direct strike aimed at Charles King. Unable to dodge, Charles King was hit and fell from the rooftop. Eleanor Bennet quickly rushed to support him as he clutched his chest, coughing up blood. Charles King, I never intended to kill you. After all, the Ice Soul Snow Toxin will slowly torment you to death. But you overestimated yourself. If Alexander King treasures you so much, perhaps he should experience the loss of his beloved son first. The masked man landed on the ground, preparing to strike Charles King again, but Eleanor Bennet stepped in front of him. I don't know what deep-seated grudge you have with the Emperor, but he is still the Empress's only son. If the Empress's spirit lives on, she surely won't forgive your actions today. Eleanor Bennet gambled, hoping the man had feelings for the late Empress. Young lady, what exactly do you know? The masked man was surprised, yet his eyes remained filled with hostility. I know nothing, except that love extends to all connected, Eleanor Bennet calmly replied. To love someone is to love everything about them. The masked figure seemed to recall something, and their emotions suddenly spiraled out of control. Charles King, I'll spare your life today. After all, living is more painful than death for you. The masked figure laughed loudly before leaping away, their laughter echoing like a ghost, sending chills down the spine of anyone who heard it. Eleanor Bennet supported Charles King, quickly checking his pulse. "Charles King, are you all right?" Eleanor Bennet knew he had severe internal injuries, with chaotic energy coursing through his body. "How do you know about his feelings for my mother?" Charles King asked Eleanor Bennet in surprise, realizing she had truly saved his life today. "It's a long story. First, I need to get you back to Bamboo Garden. You have serious internal injuries and need careful treatment." Eleanor Bennet helped him up and led him towards Bamboo Garden. At that moment, Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow hurriedly arrived, their faces pale, seemingly injured as well. "Master, we failed to protect you properly, please punish us." The two knelt down to admit their fault. "Stand up. This is not the time for punishment." Eleanor Bennet had no time to focus on them, as Charles King seemed to have fainted. The two quickly reacted and helped carry Charles King back to his room. Eleanor swiftly performed acupuncture treatment and prescribed medicine, instructing Blood Shadow to prepare it quickly. With a worried expression, Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King, who lay on the bed with a pale face. Was vengeance his only hope for the past 10 years? What kind of deep-seated hatred led to such a cruel attack on a child years ago? Eleanor Bennet sensed the malice and danger of the masked figure. Could it be love turned to hatred? She guessed that the person must have been deeply infatuated with the Queen, or else he wouldn't have spared Charles King at her behest. Blood Shadow hurriedly brought the bowl of medicine, and Eleanor Bennet carefully fed it to Charles King. "Lady Bennet, when will the master regain consciousness?" Blood Shadow asked anxiously. "He should wake up by tomorrow," Eleanor Bennet replied after checking his pulse. "Blood Shadow, how did the palace defenses become so lax tonight?" Eleanor Bennet questioned. "Lady Bennet, all the guards inside and outside the palace were poisoned, unable to move for 3 hours," Blood Shadow explained with a guilty expression. "So, you were poisoned as well?" Eleanor Bennet stepped forward to check Blood Shadow's pulse. The energy in his body was scattered, as if he had suffered severe internal injuries. "You both seem to have serious internal injuries?" Eleanor Bennet asked with suspicion. "Lady Bennet, Dark Shadow and I knew the master was in danger, so we forced ourselves to use our energy to heal, which left us in this state." Eleanor Bennet looked at the two young people in front of her, thinking that Charles King was fortunate to have such loyal protectors. She quickly wrote a prescription and urged them to take the medicine promptly. "Blood Shadow, I want to see the others who were poisoned." Eleanor Bennet recalled the masked figure from that night, still feeling unsettled. To easily defeat so many of the king's palace experts and seriously injure Charles King, the masked figure was undoubtedly a rare master. Most concerning was his skill with poison. Why did the Bryn royal family have such a dangerous enemy? Chapter 45, Inquiry. Eleanor Bennet examined the palace servants who were poisoned, realizing they were all the guards Charles King had mentioned. They used the guise of palace servants to hide and remain undetected within Prince Charles's residence. No wonder Charles King wasn't worried about information leaking, as everyone within the residence was fiercely loyal and willing to risk everything for him. Cold Shadow Sect sounded like a martial arts sect. Charles King was indeed much stronger than she had imagined, and all he did was likely in response to the mysterious figure from the previous night. Eleanor Bennet thought about the symptoms of the poisoning in the palace, resembling a type of anesthetic that temporarily paralyzed motor nerves, rendering people immobile. Eleanor Bennet returned to East Gardens, and upon seeing her, Dark Shadow quickly bowed. "Your wound hasn't healed yet, go rest." "I'll handle things here," Eleanor Bennet said, deeply admiring his loyalty. "But..." Dark Shadow hesitated, glancing inside where Charles King had yet to awaken. "Don't worry, the one from last night won't appear again." "Understood, I shall take my leave," Dark Shadow said, hesitating for a moment before departing. Eleanor Bennet entered the room and checked Charles King's pulse. His breathing gradually stabilized. She sat by his bed, quietly observing him. The dart last night was clearly aimed at her, yet he saved her without hesitation. If the masked assailant had thrown another dart, he wouldn't have been able to dodge it. "Charles King, what kind of man are you?" Eleanor Bennet felt confused, but it wasn't because of Charles King, it was because of her own heart. Charles King seemed to regain consciousness but was still in a dream. "Mother, mother." Eleanor Bennet approached him, hearing his murmurs. From his pained expression, she realized it must be a terrifying nightmare. "Charles King, wake up." Eleanor Bennet gently comforted him, hoping he would awaken. Charles King appeared more frightened in his dream, tightly gripping Eleanor Bennet's soft hand. "Charles King, wake up, it's me, Eleanor Bennet," she called, hoping he would quickly escape the nightmare. Suddenly, Charles King awoke with a start, sitting up abruptly. "Charles King, it was just a dream," Eleanor Bennet said, wiping the sweat from his forehead, understanding he had relived the most painful experience of his life. Charles King looked at Eleanor Bennet, his fear slowly subsiding. She placed a soft pillow behind his back. "I'll call Eunuch Owen to prepare breakfast for you," Eleanor Bennet offered as she stood, but Charles King held her back. "Don't go." Eleanor Bennet looked at him, her heart softened, and she sat back down. They gazed at each other for a long time, saying nothing, as a subtle atmosphere gradually enveloped the room. "Charles King, you're not hungry, but I am," Eleanor Bennet said, breaking the silence with slight embarrassment. "Blood Shadow." Charles King called out, still holding Eleanor Bennet's hand. "Don't call them, Blood Shadow and Dark Shadow are injured." "I've sent them to receive treatment," Eleanor Bennet said, standing up to find Eunuch Owen herself. As she stepped outside, she saw Eunuch Owen leading several attendants carrying food trays. Seeing Eleanor Bennet, Eunuch Owen quickly bowed. "Lady Bennet, has the